Kujak. Welcome to New York City. Today we're going to go on a brief tour of places in New York City that are directly relevant to the Civil War. Places of great interest. Most of them have great interest even aside from their relationship to the war between the states. It's impossible to go to every single one, but I think we're going to see a lot, and I think you're going to really enjoy it. In the August edition of the Civil War Times, there was an article outlined places of interest regarding the Civil War in New York City. That served as the basis and the inspiration for this tour. We've expanded it a little and maybe researched it a little more. But I have to say that really was the reason for the idea. Now, the Confederates and the Union troops, they never actually met or fought here. This wasn't a battleground of armies, but it was a battleground of ideas. And as a result, you had parades and rallies and even acts of terrorism that took place here. We saw New York City as a passionate supporter of keeping this union together. And in a couple years it became a passionate rebellion against the war, against emancipation. And a couple years later, following the conclusion of the war and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, it became once again a bastion of Union support. Now, City Hall is the place we're going to begin. And New York City Hall marks kind of the beginning and the end of Civil War involvement here in Manhattan. And I'll tell you why. Right here we're in City Hall Park, just a beautiful little park right outside of New York's City Hall, which is very difficult to gain access to post 9/11. With good cause. You may be able to get an appointment online, get in there to see the governor's room, but it's very difficult. Despite that, we have to start here. This is a place you want to be and a place you want to see. Come on, let's go take a look at it. New York City Hall. In 1861, en route to being sworn in as President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln stopped here. He was received at a party in the governor's room. Almost 4 years to the day later, Abraham Lincoln was here again. But unfortunately, it was a sad occasion. This was a site for the funeral procession en route back from Washington, D.C. to Illinois. Lincoln was laid out here for one day. During that day, they say almost 500,000 people actually came to view the body. He was right beneath the rotunda of City Hall. On the flight of steps at the top of that stairway, he was laid out. A little over 20 years later, Ulysses Grant, also a president of the United States and the victorious general of the Union troops, was laid out here as well. I might want to mention one other guy to you that you may not even know his name. His name was Elmer Ephraim Ellsworth. Ellsworth was a native New Yorker who went to Illinois in pursuit of a legal career. Became attached to Lincoln's law offices as a clerk and went to Washington with Lincoln when he was elected. When it appeared clear that there was going to be a war between the states, Ellsworth came back to New York City and got a group of volunteers. As a matter of fact, they were called the fire swabs. The reason why is because most of them were recruited from fire departments. and they went back to Washington, D.C. were one of the first Union groups ready to be active in that war. Ellsworth, now why am I mentioning him? He's considered to be the very first Union troop to die in the Civil War. Over in Arlington, Virginia, there was the Marshall Inn, and at the top of the Marshall Inn, which was a bar and an inn, the Confederate flag was flying. And they could actually see it through this telescope from the White House. It was appalling. Ellsworth told Lincoln, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." And he took some of his troops and went across the river to Arlington, where he marched into the Marshall Inn, went up to the roof, took down that Confederate flag. As he descended the stairs, the owner, a man named Jackson of the Marshall Inn, confronted him with a shotgun and at point-blank range shot him dead. Ellsworth was, as I said, the first Union troop to die. And although today very few of us even know his name, at the time it was a rallying cry for the Union. There were cities named for him in Minnesota and Wisconsin. There were all kinds of things in his honor. And he was laid in state here in 1861, just as Lincoln would be 4 years later. It became a rallying cry. People enlisted all over the country, but especially in New York. They were called Ellsworth's Volunteers, Ellsworth's Avengers. And eventually, of course, he was moved back to his hometown for burial. You know, in this city hall, it's such a shame it's not open or easily accessible to the public, because in the governor's room, it's a repository of paintings and artifacts of American history. Alexander Hamilton's portrait, the one that they use on the $10 bill, it's right there. George Washington's desk, and just a slew of other things. But for now, that's the environment we're in. We're going to go over to the subway, the 6 train, and we're going to take it up to our next stop, which is the Spring Street station. Come on, let's go. More than half of our tour is directly on the 6th line. We'll just go continually uptown on the 6th train until we get to 42nd Street. But right now, our first stop is Spring Street. Just 2 stops up from City Hall. So, let's go. We're 2 blocks west of Spring Street, the station. This is the corner of Broadway and Spring, right here. What you just saw was 513 to 527 Broadway. This was the site of the St. Nicholas Hotel. Across the street, you see a Lady Foot Locker sign right over my shoulder, and next to it a Puma store. That's 521 and 523. They're the original buildings of a place called the St. Nicholas Hotel. And why is that important? I'm going to tell you. We're going to go across the street and get closer. 521 and 523. The original parts of the St. Nicholas Hotel remain here. It used to take up a huge portion of this block. A white marble structure. Cost $1 million in 1853. Famous for a couple novelties. Had central air, central heating, register in every room. Had a white satin bridal suite that serviced only the elite. Only the creme de la creme of society could afford to even come here. But that's not what we're interested in. In 1863, while New York City was under intense pressure due to the draft riots, this great insurrection, Mayor George Opdyke of New York City moved his headquarters here, where he met with the governor of New York, head of the Union forces, the police, the fire, and they developed a strategy. They developed a plan in order to quell that terrible disturbance. That was one reason. The second is this: the St. Nicholas, this exclusive hotel. In November 1864, there was something called the Confederate fire plot, where in the hotel fire plot, where they put this stuff called Greek fire in all these hotels all over the place. They tried to cause major disturbance. Hardly had any effect. Nobody died. Very little damage was done. This hotel was one of the few places where there was any kind of serious damage. And that was, of course, the beginning of the problems for this hotel. There were other reasons for what happened and why this is all that's left, but that was the first of those things. Well, we're going to head back to the Spring Street station. We're going north on the 6th to Astor Place. So let's go. Station, our next stop on the tour. Here, at the corner of Astor Place and Cooper Square, is our next point of interest. Here in Astor Place and Cooper Square is the location of Cooper Union for the advancement of science and art. An institution of higher learning that was an absolute revolution in education. A gentleman named Peter Cooper, an American industrialist, highly successful, built America's first steam railroad engine, invested heavily in insurance, iron foundries, glue factories, real estate. Everything he touched turned to gold. Peter Cooper amassed a fortune and wanted to make it a better world. And in doing so, one of the first things he did was create this place. An education based only on aptitude and performance. No regard to race, no regard to religion, no regard to gender, no regard to wealth or social status. This was about allowing every young individual in New York City who had the ability a chance to get a first-rate education at the college level. To turn to the 20th century, his son-in-law, Abraham Hewitt, not only continued the idea, but financed it so that every student coming here get a tuition-free scholarship. If you got accepted, you had a free education. That just reinforced and underscored the original tenets of this building. As radical as that is, that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about something that happened in the basement of this building. That's where they have a location called the Great Hall. And in 1860, when he was fighting for the GOP nomination for president, Abraham Lincoln came to New York City and went to that Great Hall to deliver a speech. All the people of influence turned out. They all wanted to see this folksy lawyer from the backwoods of Illinois. They all wanted to hear him. But what they heard was a sophisticated, polished individual who went right after the Democratic lead candidate, Stephen Douglas, and his stand on the expansion of slavery. What Lincoln did was Lincoln took it piece by piece and addressed it. He went to the Constitution and used the Constitution to rebut Douglas's stands one by one and prove that he had the support of the founders. It was his vision that was consistent with the founding fathers, not Douglas's. An outcrop of this speech was that now Abraham Lincoln was perceived in a completely different manner. He was the man. And this speech jettisoned him to such a lead that he became not only the Republican candidate for president, but the president of the United States. I just want to add one thing. When he left here, he went around the corner to Broadway, down a few blocks to Matthew Brady's studio, who took a portrait, a photographic portrait of Abraham Lincoln. That portrait also reinforced the speech here. This speech was not only printed in every major newspaper, this speech was put into a pamphlet and distributed throughout the country, especially in the North, where Lincoln just gained fame and support. And along with that was that portrait that was taken in Matthew Brady's studio, where we saw a dignified statesman, not some country backwoods folksy lawyer. That was the 1-2 punch, and that got him started. So that's Cooper Union. Let's go around the corner. One of the new Cooper Union buildings is important to us too. And it's right around the corner. Come on, let's go over. This is another Cooper Union building. It's right around the corner from the place we just visited, the original Cooper Union. Unlike many modern structures, it's not a salt box. Isn't it beautiful? So many different lines. But that's besides the point. We're here about the Civil War importance. Obviously, this building is much too new to have been directly involved in the Civil War. But right here, the location of this building, between 6th and 7th Street on 3rd Avenue, that was the site of the 7th Regimental Armory. The 7th Regimental Armory was the first New York regiment dispatched for the Civil War. As a matter of fact, a few days after Fort Sumter, on April 19, 1861, the 7th Regiment marched out of here, block over to Broadway, to tens of thousands of people cheering as they marched up Broadway. This was one of those times, right after Sumter, when the place was galvanized and excited and very concerned about Southern secession. Before we leave Astor Place area, there's a spot right around the corner on Broadway that I'd like to take you to. The original building's no longer there, but it's an important site anyway, and I think one you'll be interested in. Let's go over there. 721 Broadway. Today it's the NYU's Tisch Institute for the Performing Arts. But that wasn't the case 150 years ago. It was a place called the New York Hotel. Famous for a number of reasons. First hotel to have an a la carte menu and room service. In this very lobby of what had been the building that was here, a man named Augustus Brentano started selling books from his newsstand, which ultimately became the Brentano bookstores, the Brentano book chain. But our interest in 721 Broadway and the site of the New York Hotel is that it was the hotbed of Southern sympathy. In New York at the time, it was regarded as a place where Southern spies, blockade runners, came to stay over. Strangely enough, it's one of the few hotels that was not damaged at all during the hotel fire plot, which just supported the common belief that this was a Confederate hotel. One other point is that Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, upon his release from confinement, came to New York City, and this is where he stayed. His wife, by the way, stayed uptown in Central Park West. As a matter of fact, died there. But for right now, New York Hotel. This is where it was. We're going to go back to Astor Place, get on the 6th, and go up to Union Square, 14th Street and 4th Avenue. Let's go. We're at Union Square, our next stop on the tour. This actually is a traffic island that they call Union Square East. Union Square is right across the street, and we're going to go there. But I wanted to stop here because this spot in 1783 was the actual place where George Washington and a military unit, along with a committee of citizens, accepted formally possession of New York City from the British after the Revolutionary War. And because of that, because this spot is so important, a statue was erected here. An equestrian statue of George Washington that was unveiled in 1856. It was the first public statue since George III, 6 years prior to the Revolution, 1770. And it's the first American equestrian bronze in the country. Okay, listen, let's go across the street to Union Square, and I'll tell you what it has to do with the Civil War. Come on. The statue of George Washington we were just speaking about. In 1861, just days after Fort Sumter had suffered that bombardment, forced to surrender, the tattered flag from Sumter was draped across the statue of George Washington. It evoked such passion. There was a huge rally here in Union Square. Over 100,000 people turned out in support of the Union. That was 1861. A little over 4 years later, the funeral procession of Abraham Lincoln took place right here. Came right past from City Hall, came right past up Broadway. Houses, almost every house was draped in black, whether it was the windows or the doors or both. From Battery Park all the way to Central Park, as Lincoln's funeral procession went past. As a matter of fact, Union Square, we're here at the entrance, 14th Street entrance to the park, but the park is from 14th to 17th. You go a couple blocks past that to 20th Street, right on the corner of 20th Street was the home where a young boy, 6.5 years old, watched from his window as that procession went past. And that boy was Teddy Roosevelt. Do you know that at the Peterson House, the place right across the street from Ford Theater, Lincoln was shot in the Ford Theater. They brought his body across the street. He died approximately 9 hours later. At the Peterson House, their exhibit says that they believe 1 out of 3 people, 1 out of every 3 people outside the Confederacy actually saw that funeral procession. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the kind of passion we're talking about? 1 out of every 3 people in a time with limited travel got to see that funeral procession. Well, that ends part 1 for us of this tour. If it's near lunch for you, I suggest you get back on that 6, go up to 42nd Street. It'll take you to Grand Central Station, which is a landmark not only for New York City, but for the nation. But not only do you get to see that landmark, there are numerous places to eat, fun places, all different kinds of places, right in Grand Central Station. So if you're going to have lunch, you might want to try there. But whether or not you go there, we have to get back on the 6 right now, and let's head up to 42nd Street.